Thank you. Well, thank you so much, John, and thanks to everyone for inviting me, the Ho Center, and Tatiana, and everyone for being taking such good care of me. If you felt like a charlatan wading into esoteric literature with your students, I can only imagine, you can only imagine how much of a charlatan I feel speaking on Mahāyāna Buddhism here in the presence of Paul Harrison, whose name I will take in vain many times over the course of the evening. But I did precisely, and I apologize in advance actually for not speaking on esoteric Buddhism, which is my proper gochara. But I had this idea banging around for a couple of years, and I thought, well, what better chance to try to work it up a little bit more and to present it in front of people who actually know things about this and see if it holds water. So, what are Mahāyāna Sutras? Whom are they for? When were they composed? Where, why, and how? These are the basic questions that frame the field of study of the literature of the Buddhist Universal Way. There are a number of ways in which these questions have been and may be answered. The tradition itself has advanced at least one set of answers. They are ancient, timeless even, or eternal, discourses of the Buddhas, meant for elite disciples on the path to Buddhahood, so-called bodhisattvas. They were delivered in our world by the Buddha, Lord Shakyamuni, in India, in order to communicate the theory and practice of removing the fetters of cyclic rebirth to find the freedom of unexcelled complete enlightenment, Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. As for how, there is a more complicated set of answers given in traditional sources, ranging from ordinary lecture to visionary revelation. Modern scholarship, of course, has rightly been suspicious of these answers. Those who have studied this literature have advanced a number of alternative etic answers. Generally speaking, they have been thought to be humanly composed works, produced by processes of accretion over centuries, long after the death of the Buddha, meant to serve as legitimating devices for the introduction of new doctrines and practices into the institutional framework of the Buddhist communities. That is, modern scholarship has reached a variety of different conclusions regarding the who, when, and how of these documents. There has not, in general, though, been as much disagreement about the what or the why. That is, regarding the what, scholars have more or less accepted the emic designations of certain works as sutras of the Mahāyāna, with some tinkering around the edges in the cases where the same work may be attributed by indigenous sources to either mainstream or Mahāyāna revelation. And they have also tended to accept the emic view regarding the why. While they may not lend credence to the idea that humans may attain a timeless state of unexcelled complete enlightenment, they nonetheless have tended to approach the scriptures of the Mahāyāna as vehicles for communicating a message consisting in the theory and practice of a kind of Buddhism. The modern perspective has been more cynical, to be sure, insofar as the focus has in general been on the innovation rather than the timelessness of the teachings, and on their role in serving to legitimize these novel doctrines by attributing them to the historical Buddha. And there is some truth in this, certainly. New concepts and practices are introduced in some Mahāyāna scriptures, and most are attributed to the Buddha in some form or other. However, this mode of interpretation fails to comprehend what these scriptures may have done socially, and in so doing it backgrounds important evidence concerning the self-imagination of these Buddhist communities and their strategies for constructing and maintaining a corporate identity. That is, I would suggest that scholarship would do well to look more broadly at textual practices in the Buddhist communities and at communicative functions other than the directly referential. Among the small cohort of scholars working on this literature, this has already begun to happen, with various alternative models being proposed, including the so-called cult of the book, their function in presencing the power of Buddhas, their liturgical functions, magical healing, and the like. My own small contribution today, offered as an outsider to the field here at one of its great centers, will be to try to offer one new perspective on what these works do or may have done for the traditions that composed and preserved them. Indications of the approach I am describing were articulated 26 years ago by the preeminent scholar of the Mahāyāna Sutras, Stanford's own Paul Harrison, who wrote, quote, "At present, we barely understand the Mahāyāna Sutra as a literary genre, and are not likely to do so until we forego the practice of mining these texts like quarries for their occasional deposits of doctrine and approach them rather as whole works." More recently, in 2003, Harrison offered the further programmatic suggestion that scholarship strive to, quote, see past the texts to the lives of the people that produced them, to ask what impact those lives had on the texts and vice versa. In between these two interventions in the field, in 1995, Harrison made another of his many fecund observations, which has inspired in part the perspective I take up in what follows. He wrote, quote, religions do not succeed or flourish because their doctrines are intellectually compelling or their ideas are morally noble, but because they, or rather their practitioners, capture people's imaginations in a certain way. They arouse their faith and convince them that they provide an exclusive or unique access to whatever power is held to underlie or pervade the world, to the numinous, to the transcendent, call it what you will. What I present today is a commentary of sorts, and I think confirmation of the first half of this suggestion, that religions may succeed or flourish because they capture people's imaginations, and that the sutras of the Mahāyāna served an essential social function in so doing. On the other hand, while I don't disagree that convincing people of the religion's access to a special kind of power is indeed part of the project of many Mahāyāna sutras, including those I will look at today, I also hope to demonstrate that some of the effective force of Mahāyāna rhetoric is not best understood as convincing people. At least I disagree if what is meant by convincing people of something implies that this is accomplished by an act of the logical intellect, bringing someone around to a considered opinion as one might convince someone that exercise would be good for them. As can readily be observed of that type of convincing, it has not in general shown itself to be especially effective in changing people's behavior. This is well known in advertising and the semiology of advertising. The most effective way to change people's behavior is not through convincing them in that way. People don't buy a particular brand of soap because they are convinced of its chemical effectiveness. Rather, other techniques of rhetoric that bypass the deliberative functions, deliberative faculties are employed. What I hope to illustrate today is a distinctive use of literary techniques in Mahāyāna sutras aimed indeed at convincing their auditors of something, of capturing their imagination, but through something like the more crafty and subtle semiotics of advertising rather than declaration or demonstration. This is not to say that such more direct forms of convincing are not present. They clearly are. One of the sutras we will look at today, any minute now, I promise, the Suvarnabhasa, there are claims such as the following, quote, those who hear this sutra and who cause others to hear it, whoever rejoice in it, and those who do honor to it will be honored throughout numerous millions of eons by gods, snake deities, and men, by kinnaras, asuras, and yakshas. They will gladly be accepted by the Buddhas in the 10 directions and likewise by the Bodhisattvas. Here, in what I call the straightforward or ordinary use of karma discourse in the sutras, a convincing claim is made. Do this, get that. There are powers that this religion has that may be accessed effectively through interaction with its scriptures. What else is there to see, though? The techniques I seek to draw attention to are essentially narrative devices. It is, I think, unproblematical to observe that both individuals and societies make sense of themselves, their identities and their imperatives through narrative. Thus, one major avenue of grafting new constituencies onto a movement is to incorporate them narratively, to provide a story through which they can interpret their own situations and actions to themselves and others in a gratifying manner, or at least in a cogent manner. The contention of this paper is that one of the strategies of certain Mahāyāna sutras is the narrative incorporation of the audience, a rhetoric of suggestion or seduction that invites the reader to imagine herself as a heroine in a romantic tale of the ultimate triumph of the ancient and honorable Mahāyāna. That is, I want to claim that in the case of at least 3 distinctive and notably influential sutras, the social function these works play in providing appealing counter-narratives to those advanced by the mainstream Shravaka traditions is arguably of equal or greater centrality than their role in claiming authoritative sanction for new doctrines. There are, after all, numerous sutras with little or no significant doctrinal content beyond self-aggrandizement. One of these, the famous Sadharma Pundarika or Lotus Sutra, is exemplary in this regard. Nonetheless, the Lotus made a crucial contribution to the early communities through the narrative tools it elaborated and propagated. That is, in the case of such works, it is important to keep in mind that they were not only or primarily to be read or recited for information. Rather, they served in large part to socialize readers into a shared world of meaning, and in so doing, to provide a meaningful framework for the auditors to make sense of their identities, their relationships to the Shravaka and Mahāyāna traditions, and the imperatives for action implied thereby. Among the sutras in which this function is prominent or paramount, there are three that we will focus on today. The Suvarnabhasa, the Pratyutpanna Buddha Samukha Avastita Samadhi Sutra, and the aforementioned Sandarbha Pundarika or Lotus. Before I flesh out my case in full, however, we will need to establish some baselines in the literary analysis of these scriptures by exploring the rhetorical forms employed in these sutra discourses. Then I will discuss the way in which these forms function within the discursive horizon, that is, within the constructed world of the sutras themselves, before suggesting how the works then reach beyond the horizon of the world of the work into the social worlds of the auditors. The literary phenomena I seek to illustrate is notable for the particular way in which it leverages two literary religious tropes, the Jataka, or former life story, and the Vyakarana, or prediction of future Buddhahood. In line with the aforementioned focus on Mahāyāna sutras as legitimizing devices, Peter Skilling has commented on these two features as prominent in Mahāyāna sutras, writing, quote, "Among the literary devices of authentication widely employed in Buddhist literature are the Jataka, an account of a past life of one or more of the characters related to the present events, and the Vyakarana, a prediction given by a Buddha of the future Buddhahood of one or more members of the audience. These devices connect the sutra with the Buddhas of the past, present, and future, and thereby establish its authenticity," unquote. While Skilling is certainly correct that this is one function of these literary devices, there is more in play here than mere assent to the validity of new revelations. The paired employment of Jataka and Vyakarana are crucial in an ideological revaluation in which Mahāyāna discourses seek to valorize their own traditions by narratively incorporating and provincializing the Shravakayana traditions. The Jataka, as is well known, is a story form in which a tale is told of a past time, always with the ideological payoff of that story being taken as having pronounced relevance for the particular moment in which the tale is being related. The form is notable for what might be called its Agatha Christie conclusion, in which all is brought to light. This is the samudana, in which typically the Buddha, in the frame story, identifies characters in the story he just related with persons in the frame story. Samudana means connection, but by implication it reveals the relevance of the story to the real lives of the characters in the frame story. For example, two people may have approached him who are quarreling. The Buddha relates a tale of two quarreling persons in the past, describes the resolution of the conflict, and then informs his two contemporaries that they, in fact, were literally those two persons in the past, with the implication that the current quarrel may be resolved along the lines of the paradigmatic tale of their past. The Vyakarana is a narrative element in which a person encounters a Buddha, usually does something of note in their presence, whereupon the Buddha then announces that that person shall, at a certain time in the future, become enlightened as a Buddha named so-and-so in a Buddha field named so-and-so, and sometimes in an era named so-and-so. It becomes a commonplace of the Mahāyāna that all bodhisattvas experience this moment in their careers. It is a sine qua non of the bodhisattva path. This is so much the case that, as with so much of Mahāyāna narrative, this moment is translated into a ritual enactment in the initiation rite of the Buddhist esoteric traditions. At the culmination of the esoteric initiation, the initiating master stands, adopts the stylized mudra of Vyakarana, and pronounces the disciple so-and-so will be enlightened in the future as the Buddha so-and-so. How then do these forms work together in the Mahāyāna sutras we are concerned with? Let us take one example. One of the literary efforts of the Lotus Sutra was to appropriate the culture heroes of the Shravakayana by creatively retelling their backstories. For instance, in the 9th chapter, the chapter of the prophecy of Ananda and so on, the Buddha speaks of his amanuensis Ananda, one of the more important characters established in the mainstream Shravakayana scriptures. Thank you. The Lotus makes a bodhisattva of him. The Buddha says, quote, "In the future you shall become the Buddha Sagaravaradara Buddhi Vikriditabhinya. Your realm shall be Anavanamita Vaijayanti, and the era will be Manonya Shabda Garjita." Unquote. This resulted, quite a mouthful. This resulted in some confusion among the text internal audience, who cannot understand why a Shravaka would receive a prophecy. The Buddha then relates a Jataka, explaining that in a previous life, Ananda and he were both before the Buddha Dharma Gaganabhiyudgata Raja. And at that time, Ananda conceived the spirit of enlightenment. That is, he became a bodhisattva, right? He had the bodhicittotpada. Upon hearing the prophecy in the frame story, Ananda recalls the true teaching and his prior vow, Sadharmam anusmaratisma atmanascha purva pranidanam. Ananda, and subsequently Rahula, Vaishajyaraja, Shariputra, and others, are made to conspire in this ex post facto re-identification by assenting to the revisionary history. Something similar happens in the Suvarnabhasa, where across a few chapters, beginning with chapter 15, a goddess asks why 10,000 godlings had come to Trayastrimsha to hear the Buddha teach the Suvarnabhasa. In particular, she is concerned that these godlings seem rather to be slackers, spiritually speaking. They were not known to have done all the various things bodhisattvas stereotypically do, giving away their bodies and kingdoms and so forth. So what were they doing there? Rather similar to the concern in the Lotus about how Ananda, a mere Shravaka, could have merited a prophecy of enlightenment. A longish series of Jatakas ensues, whose upshot is that the slacker godlings had all been with him in the past, and not just him, but his father, wife, Ananda, and the whole cast of mainstream sutra characters. They had performed a virtuous act and established a karmic connection with the Buddha, for which reason they were born in Trayastrimsha to hear the Suvarna, where the Buddha in the frame story prophesies their future Buddhahood. That's Jataka Vyakarana. It might be said then that the Jataka and the Vyakarana are, as literary forms, correlated. Both are, in essence, backward-looking with a present focus. It is not unusual for characters in the nested story of a Mahāyāna Jataka to receive prophecy realized or effected in the frame story. That is all well and good, however, but not terribly remarkable. Of course, one might say the Mahāyāna Sutras are concerned to revalue the existing narrative stock of the mainstream traditions to elevate the Mahāyāna. This is a truism. There is more to the story, though. And this is where I think the sutras we are considering demonstrate a remarkable literary bravado, one which arguably was invaluable to the thriving of the movement. For the sutras we are considering conjoin these literary models with a distinctive feature, resulting in what can only be called an ideological tour de force. In essence, the discourses of the sutra perform what in the dramatic arts is called breaking the fourth wall. In the theater, this refers to the wall that is tacitly presumed to exist at the proscenium of the stage. In actuality, of course, the proscenium is an opening that allows the viewer visual access to the events in the world of the characters. But in the world of the willing suspension of disbelief shared between actors and audience, there is a wall there, as there would be in the real world. Breaking this wall refers to those moments when actors violate this compact, recognizing the existence of and sometimes directly addressing the audience. One example is the famous moment in Peter Pan when Pan calls upon the audience to applaud to bring the poisoned Tinkerbell back to life. In general, this is frowned upon, considered breaking character and indeed breaking the compact that establishes the magic of the theater. Yet, of course, it does happen. More commonly in the modern period than in the past, perhaps, but some Mahāyāna sutras clearly do something of the sort. For it is a curious fact that while the characters in the sutras never break character and directly address the audience auditors in the real world, these works do make numerous references to their future readers or devotees. This then is my primary thesis, that one prominent rhetorical strategy of certain Mahāyāna sutras is to reach out beyond the frame story to the larger frame of reference, the world in which the reader reads the sutra. These sutras invite, even suggest, that the reader self-identify with the characters in the sutra on the other side of the fourth wall, with the presumed consequence that they would shape their identities, behavior, and socio-religious allegiances accordingly. and in so doing, one once again sees the device of Vyakarana employed in conjunction with the Jataka form to glorify the characters in the later frame via their narratively prior consecration as religious heroes, future Buddhas. Let us look at how this works in 3 influential sutras. In the Suvarnabhasa Sutra, one can clearly see the basic structure of this new rhetorical strategy. That is, 1, the enormous benefits of upholding the Mahāyāna are extolled. 2, Jatakas are narrated of the past history of the scripture, whose characters are, via samudana, equated with characters in the frame story, which is the sutra itself. 3, a second implicit samudana is suggested by the assertion that whoever in the future encounters the sutra, i.e. the reader in the present, has, from the mere evidence of that contact, ipso facto previously been a practitioner of the Mahāyāna, and not merely a fair weather one who has briefly encountered the teachings, but one who has, quote, served numerous Buddhas in the past. Such a person is thus not merely promised future goods for action in the present, in the convincing model, but is entitled to feel that they have already earned some status and may expect correlated benefits now. In the 13th chapter, the theme of the past Vyakarana being realized in the present is foreshadowed by a Jataka in which Shakyamuni himself is said to have heard the sutra from Akshobhya in a former life. He tells a Jataka of a king Susambhava who, having sought out a famed preacher of the Dharma Ratnochaya, the king requests the teaching of the Suvarna from this monk. He gives the teaching. The king is overwhelmed by religious emotion and worships the sutra. The Buddha then gives the samudana. Quote, I, the Buddha Shakyamuni, was the king Susambhava, and the Buddha Akshobhya was the monk Ratnochaya. Because I heard this sutra then and rejoiced, I obtained a body that has the color of gold and has the mark of 100 merits, always pleasing to behold, etc., etc. For 990 million eons, I was a universal monarch. So is the mass of my many immeasurable merits that I attained enlightenment. Unquote. The payoff for such contact in the present would presumably be obvious to the reader-listener, given Shakyamuni's evident success subsequently. The reader is then told, breaking the fourth wall, quote, those who hear this sutra, the excellent Suvarnabhasa, have worshipped hundreds of thousands of former Buddhas, and because of this merit root, they hear this sutra, unquote. That is, there is an implicit samudana in which those who read or hear the sutra outside the text are identified with characters in the story, and thus have likewise performed glorious deeds in the past, and perhaps even attained a prophecy of Buddhahood. The credulous reader is thus invited to entertain the flattering notion that the Buddha was talking about them, and take up once again the task of defending the new old orthodoxy from contemporary critics. They're so vain, that is, they think the sutra is about them. Thus, we begin to see a structure emerging. The scripture offers conventional promises of lots of wonderful things to convince the audience of the excellence of the Mahāyāna. They are reminded of prior lives of Buddhist culture heroes, some known and some new, via tales of the past, Jataka. The Jataka form is resolved through the further suggestion that merely having heard the sutra is evidence of prior contact, samudana, identifying with the heroes of the past. The implication is unavoidable that the hearer is therefore one who is already due protection, glory, victory, etc. The catch, of course, is all this obtains only if they buy in to the implications of the narrative identification and frame their interpretations of their lives accordingly. The Pratyutpanna Buddha Samukha Avastita Samadhi Sutra, or Pratyutpanna Sutra as it has usually been called for convenience, continues this strategy, but adds a significant narrative leitmotif that recurs across a wide range of Mahāyāna literature. Like the Suvarna, this sutra includes a Jataka of the Buddha himself learning the sutra and receiving Vyakarana as a result. It too speaks at length of the benefits of the scripture and its samadhi. It too has a Jataka of sorts narrating the past of the characters in the sutra itself. The most profoundly remarkable element found in the Pratyutpanna consists of a narrative of 8, in my opinion, of 8 bodhisattva heroes and an associated coterie of 500 Lichavi youths who volunteer and are then prophesied to uphold this Mahāyāna teaching in the degenerate age of the last 500 years of the Dharma. Now, of course, the implication. It is in this period that the Pratyutpana claims it will reappear in the human world after disappearing for a while after the death of the Buddha. The context of its reappearance, of course, is that of the sutra's composition. So the bulk of attention on this sutra has been its function in legitimating scriptural innovation. However, there is another aspect that is equally important, or plausibly equally important, I'm arguing. The readers, hearers of the sutra are invited fairly explicitly to imagine themselves as the rebirth of one of the 500 and accordingly to take up the cause. The Buddha prophesies that in the future, after the time of the narrative of the sutra, the scripture will disappear from the human world, only to reappear in the end times of the last 500 years of his Dharma. The narrator then states, quote, "Thereupon the Bodhisattva and Mahasattva Bhadrapala, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Ratnakara, and the Lichavi youths wept. And they promised, when the true Dharma is rejected, we shall accept, master, copy, preserve, read, propagate, and exert ourselves in the endeavor to cultivate such sutras as these," unquote. 500 monks, nuns, and male and female laypersons rise to offer personal service to these heroes. The Buddha then predicts, quote, "After I have entered nirvana and all the relics have been distributed, they will go to share the lot of the devas. After descending again, they will act in accordance with their resolve," unquote. Okay, so far so good. This is a story that can account for the belated revelation of the Mahāyāna Sutras. However, the clincher, the ideological payoff in terms of social solidarity and in-group identification is still to come. The Buddha asserts that, quote, "Apart from all these 500 who have stood forth in my presence, no one else will accept, preserve, or read this sutra," unquote. That is, anyone who identifies with the group of Pratyutpana Sutraists may safely identify themselves, on the Buddha's authority, as one of the glorious 500 steadfast bodhisattvas whose exploits are set forth in the scripture itself. For we are told, quote, "No one else will do so but them." To those who credit this identification, the sutra then becomes not the story of distant Buddhas and bodhisattvas of old, but the very story of the group itself. Lest there be any ambiguity, verse 33 of chapter 13 reads, quote, "If anyone cherishes this sutra, accepts it, recites it, keeps it, and expounds it, you should know that he is one of the 500 people, and never doubt it," unquote. I think the implication is abundantly clear. The strong suggestion is that anyone involved in this tradition is not a newbie, but one of the 500 heroes prophesied by the Buddha to uphold the Mahāyāna, and who have, in the sutra narrative, already received a future prediction of future Buddhahood. I should observe, for full disclosure, that this remarkable passage was in fact remarked upon by none other than Paul Harrison long ago in his 1990 translation of the sutra, which is full of similarly long and perspicacious notes on important passages in the text. Though he there identified it as, in line with Skilling's observations, a, quote, authenticating device. While that reading is certainly plausible, and as I mentioned before, it is undeniable that the Pratyutpana plays an important role in Mahāyāna discourses of authenticity, I suggest that other narrative and social dynamics may also be in play here. In the Saddharma Pundarika, this rhetoric functions both within and without the frame of the text. Within the text, as I observed above, the Buddha elevates the arhats, the culture heroes of the Shravakayana, by elaborating tales of their crypto-bodhisattvahood, consecrating them with prophecies of Buddhahood, and seducing them through such flattery into allegiance with the Mahāyāna, all within the horizon of the narrated story of the sutra. It also, however, like the Suvarna and the Pratyutpana, points off the page at the reader, implying you too are granted prophecy and will attain unexcelled enlightenment as the vanguard of not a new, but an allegedly more ancient type of culture hero, as it claims that anyone who has read even a verse of the sutra, i.e. all readers of the text, all people who encounter the text, have ipso facto heard the teaching before and vowed to fight the good fight in all future lives. In the Lotus Sutra, much of the discussion uses the technique of Jataka to create mystique regarding the new revelations of the Mahāyāna. In the very opening chapter, for instance, in response to a question from Maitreya, Shakyamuni tells a tale of an ancient Buddha in a cosmic and wonderful time of purity and goodness, who taught a wonderful sutra, the Lotus Sutra of the Fine Dharma, or True Dharma. The tradition was carried on by a special bodhisattva called Varaprabha, who taught it to a rather wayward disciple, Yashaskama, the guy who wants fame. The Buddha unpacks this, indicating that long, long ago, he himself was the bodhisattva, and his wayward son Yashaskama was Maitreya. Later, just before the famous parable of the conjured city, Shakyamuni tells of a teaching of the lotus long, long ago to 16 special disciples, who taught it to countless others in what can only be described as a veritable orgy of glory and enlightenment. Then, in classic Jataka style, the Buddha unpacks the narrative, asserting that he himself was one of the 16, and, quote, "The living beings who were converted at that time are you yourselves, O monks, and the Shravakas who will come in the future after my death," unquote. The monks here are characters within the text, but the future Shravakas presumably has an extra textual referent, pointing to the communities who heard and structured their communities in some way around the existence of the text. Elsewhere in the Lotus, it is related how, in addition to the famous culture heroes mentioned by name, there was a group of 500 arhats that previously received Vyakarana, prediction. These 500, note the number, subsequently vow to preach the scripture in the future. They say, quote, "Lord, we ourselves, vayam api," right, us, really us, will make great effort to proclaim this scripture, Dharma Pariyaya, even later in other worlds. Apitu kalu punar bhagavan anyasu lokadatushu. That is, not as per Hurwitz's translation of Kumarajiva, other lands, but later, punar, in other lives, in other galaxies, lokadatu. This is evidently another redaction of the special narrative found also in the Pratyutpanna. For Buddha later states of the fourfold Sangha of that time, quote, "Can they possibly have been anyone else? They are right here in the midst of this very group, that is, the 500 bodhisattvas headed by Bhadrapala," now these 500 bodhisattvas headed by Bhadrapala, the 500 nuns headed by Singhachandra, and the 500 upasakas headed by Sugata Chetana, all persons who will not regress from unexcelled complete Buddhahood, unquote. This suggests, to me at least, that there is evidently a significant degree of intertextuality between these three scriptures, which might validate my treating them together on stylistic grounds. There are many other similar passages. The Buddha says, for instance, if there is anyone who can receive and keep, read and recite, recall properly, cultivate and practice, and copy this sutra, be it known that that person has seen Shakyamuni Buddha, that he might have heard this scripture from the Buddha's mouth. Be it known that that person has made offerings to Shakyamuni Buddha. I think that's especially important, I don't elaborate it here, but in the context of the belief that particularly encountering a Buddha has a special quality, right? And the problems that come into communities that don't in fact have Buddhas around. And so various people have commented how scriptural recitation, consecration of images and so on serve as mediating, Zen ritual also, mediating forces to bring presence of Buddhas into the world. So here this text is asserting that, in fact, if you encounter the lotus, you have that. Right? A few final observations about some of the literary suggestions. One is the role of memory in this theology. The Shravakas who allow their stories to be recast within a Mahāyāna framework, who allow themselves to be reconsecrated as bodhisattvas avant la lettre, or at least avant son lettre, are recast as remembering something they already knew. This is consistent with the insistence that the Mahāyāna is not new. And while there is certainly a legitimizing aspect to that insistence, there is again something more. To sum up so far, I believe one can discern in these sutras a clear rhetorical strategy operative in early mid-Mahāyāna Buddhism. One sees a consistent rhetoric calculated to seduce followers of the Shravaka-yana to the emergent Bodhisattva-yana, by, in a sense, writing these contemporaries into the scriptures themselves. The narrative so constructed arguably lent a sense of solidarity to members of the fragile Mahāyāna community by suggesting that A, they are not just ordinary people, but members of the elite 500 prophesied stalwarts, and B, they have all been working at this for eons under numerous Buddhas, so they should soldier on together. What do we make of this? Sociologist Peter Berger has emphasized the importance to personal identity and group cohesion, the smooth functioning of societies, that is, of worldviews and narratives that allow individuals to locate themselves in social space, to identify the roles that they legitimately inhabit, which then provide meaning and guidance, blueprints even, for their subsequent behavior. Berger observes that, quote, the experience of conversion to a meaning system that is capable of ordering the scattered data of one's biography is liberating and profoundly satisfying. Perhaps this has its roots in a deep human need for order, purpose, and intelligibility, unquote. Sociology, of course, begins from the observation that these meaning systems are socially constructed. Speaking of two examples in which individuals are guided to change their sense of social location, Berger says, quote, the Chinese brainwasher, this is one of his examples, this is written in the 60s, conspires with his victim in fabricating a new life story for the latter, just as does the psychoanalyst with his patient. In both situations, the victim-patient comes to believe that he is discovering truths about himself that were there long before. Right? Anusmaratisma, you're recalling what you had forgotten. I want to suggest that the rhetoric of Mahāyāna sutras performed a similar function as the brainwasher or psychiatrist. No one can force another to change their legitimating, guiding narratives that they employ to orient themselves in and give sense to the chaotic worlds they confront. Moments of so-called anumi can precipitate these. War, death of loved ones, divorce, these are all moments of crisis, of the breakdown of earlier value systems and narratives that often lead to challenging occasions of refabrication of underlying personal narratives. But in general, a change in these fundamental orientations can only come about through a choice in which the individual finds the new formulation more compelling than the ones they held previously. The brainwasher makes friends with their victim, adopting the guise of common cause against their former friends and compatriots, interpreted as cruel and misguided in the new narrative. And the patient of the psychiatrist, as the saying goes, has to want to change. In this light, we might consider that certain Mahāyāna sutras participate in an attempt to provide sufficient grounds for the auditor's readers to adopt new narratives to guide their relationship to the Dharma and the various communities of meaning and meaningful practice associated with it. The literary devices of Jataka and Vyakarana are deployed to provincialize the prior mainstream traditions as expedient devices for a local and recalcitrant population, the much maligned Saha world, where Shakyamuni is entitled to hazardous duty pay. The culture heroes of the prior dispensation, which I am here assuming are revered within the prior meaning system of the auditors of the sutra, right? Mahāyāna sutras assume that people are steeped in a particular discursive world. The culture heroes of these prior dispensation are revealed to actually be in service of a much older, more profound, much larger world of meaning, and as having received emoluments in that world, in the form of prophecy of future Buddhahood and Jatakas describing their expanded prior careers. The auditor is then invited to imagine that they too are not the limited provincial persons they thought they were, or that they were in the earlier value system. These literary forms are brought into service then as powerful socializing mechanisms that seduce the reader into active identification with the Mahāyāna narratives and its embedded values, and thus solidarity with the Buddhist communities that follow these scriptures. Just as a modern youth might see Star Wars or read The Lord of the Rings and identify strongly with Luke Skywalker or Frodo Baggins, so Mahāyāna sutras are spiritual adventure tales that encourage identification with their spiritual heroes, the Bodhisattvas. As an aside, it may be significant that this self-identification, though probably taking the place in the environs of a public recitation, is, initially at least, a private affair. The auditor is not called upon to avow their conclusion. That's me, I'm a bodhisattva, one of the 500. So there is no rhetorical separation by social hierarchy. Though presumably aimed at male adults, others can get it quietly or silently. There is no way of knowing, of course, what anyone in the period of the flourishing of the Mahāyāna in India thought when they heard these sutras. But I do believe the structure of the rhetoric is such that the implications I described above are at least plausible. Though there is no way to directly corroborate what an auditor may have thought in first millennium India, based upon the above observations, I believe a solid case can nonetheless be made that this type of narrative seduction was an integral part of at least segments of the Mahāyāna movements as they developed. The claim that these narratives were employed extra-textually can be considerably strengthened by consideration of similar strategies at work in later Buddhist cultures. Actual employment of these narratives in the manner I am suggesting can be attested at least as early as the 10th century in Tibet, where something very similar makes an appearance in the early historical work, the Testament of Ba, or the Testament of Wa, the Wache. In that work, one reads that at the founding of the early imperial monastery of Samye, the consecrating abbot, Shantarakshita, is reported to have told Ba or Wa Selnang that the fact, quote, "the fact that we know each other and that the spirit of enlightenment was generated did not first occur in this life. Innumerable lives previously, you were my main disciple, generating the spirit of enlightenment, and you were named Nyanendra, Yeshe Wangbo," unquote. Wa, it should be observed, was an early monk from the influential and wealthy Wa clan, exactly the type of disciple a foreign missionary wants. It were possible for Shantarakshita to merely operate with his student in the discursive imaginary of contemporaneous Tibet. He did not, however. He took the extra step of inviting Selnang to adopt a new meta-narrative of his life that included a backstory in India and presumably one or more lives dedicated to the same ideological aims, or to the ideological aims of his mentor Shantarakshita and the institutions that he represented. There are numerous examples of this sort to be found in Tibetan sources. The Tibetan historian Ge Shunupel recounts a dialogue that allegedly took place in the early 15th century between the Tibetan Pakmodru king and the Indian guru Vanaratna, in which the latter tells the king that their relation as master and disciple had already been established in an earlier life. The king's faith, we are told, was accordingly strengthened. This seems to have been seems to have been a successful discursive stratagem for Vanaratna. For years later, he apparently said much the same thing to that king's successor. We read, quote, "Before leaving the court of Gungalekpa, the spiritual preceptor confirmed to the ruler that, as with his older brother Chakpa Jungne, a special relationship already established in an earlier lifetime existed with him too," unquote. Elsewhere, in the illustrated autobiography of Yulmo Wat Tenzin Norbu, we read as well of a teacher telling a student, "We are not only master and disciple recently, but have had an unbroken connection as master and disciple through many lifetimes." A similar phenomenon may still be seen to operate in contemporary Tibetan Buddhism. When I was on the late lamented University of Wisconsin college year program in Nepal, a certain reincarnated Lama told a schoolmate of mine, in the frame story of real life, a sort of jataka in which the two of them figured. As they were visiting the ruins of Nalanda Monastery, this Rinpoche began to tell his students of one of his past lives as a student there, presumably in the late first millennium, indicating which cell had been his in the ruined foundations. He mentioned that there was a mouse who used to visit him in his room, and that he would feed the mouse rice grains while he studied, such that the two of them developed a relationship. He thereupon identified my school chum as having been, at that time, the mouse. The parallel to the rhetorical structure of the Jataka literature, as well as its samudana in the frame story, is clear as day. The two, it is implied, have a prior karmic connection which resulted in the present situation, the accomplished master now feeding his student on the grains of Dharma teaching. It should be clear that the implication is palpable that this also implies commitment and allegiance. The rhetoric is very seductive as well, implying as it does the specialness of the student. This approach is moreover by no means rare. When I recently mentioned the thesis of this paper to a colleague, he immediately related a story of traveling of his own, of traveling a long time to see an out-of-the-way Lama in eastern Tibet. When he got there, the first thing the Lama did was to say that since you worked so hard to get here, we must have a strong prior connection. Nor are modern scholars of the Buddhist traditions immune to these rhetorical seductions. No less an eminence than the late Edward Kanza himself evidently found these narratives quite congenial. In the first volume of his fascinating Memoirs of a Modern Gnostic, Kanza wrote, quote, "It has been my conviction that I have come from a higher realm, that my great knowledge of the Mahāyāna cannot be explained by what I could study in this life, but is based on my memory of what I learnt before, and that I was sent to the Western barbarians so as to soften their hearts by teaching them the holy prajna paramita, unquote. Clearly, the sometimes rather arrogant Kanza was unable to resist giving some credence to the Vajrachedika's assertion that, quote, this dharma cannot be heard by those of inferior inclinations, unquote. There are other indications like this that kind of reach across, right? I would construe these types of assertions found across a broad range of Mahāyāna sutras as likewise gestures to break the fourth wall. Ipso facto, anyone who hears these words is effectively consecrated as a special bodhisattva and part of the Mahāyāna in-group. When I presented a first essay at this thesis some years ago, over lunch afterwards I was regaled with similar stories of modern scholars reading themselves into the history of Buddhism, constructing jatakas that consecrate them as culture heroes. Translator Jeffrey Hopkins, I am told, has related a whole secret life, Sangwe Namtar, to his students, in which he figures, among others, as the reincarnation of Chankya Rilpe Dorje, the Mongolian Lama who oversaw the translation of the Tibetan canons into Manchu. Today, evidently, he has turned his hand to English. This phenomenon has not escaped the attention of contemporary anthropologists. Abraham Zablocki, in discussing what he called tulku envy, tulku, for those who don't know, is the Tibetan word for recognized reincarnations. So speaking of tulku envy, he observes that, quote, some Westerners seem highly drawn to the tulku system's implications of an esoteric and exotic secret identity, one which parallels his heroic narratives found in Western pop culture, but with a specifically Buddhist religious cast, unquote. Nor need this be limited to the mythology of Buddhism. Though the literary devices differ, the world of Harry Potter has exercised a remarkable influence on the self-narratives of contemporary readers. Recently, my eldest daughter, now 14, confessed to me that she had secretly been expecting her letter from Hogwarts on her 11th birthday and experienced some real disappointment, what sociologists might call a mild case of anomie, when the owl did not arrive, problematizing her narrative. Finally, though I fear the comparison may seem invidious to some, I can't resist suggesting another modern parallel, also non-Buddhist, but employing a similar rhetoric. A recent New York Times article on Ayn Rand had this to say, quote, Rand's particular intellectual contribution, the thing that makes her so popular and so American, is the way she managed to mass market elitism. To convince so many people, especially young people, that they could be geniuses without being in any concrete way distinguished. Or rather, that they could distinguish themselves by the ardor of their commitment to Rand's teaching. The very form of her novels makes the same point. They are as cartoonish and sexed up as any bestseller, yet they are constantly suggesting that the reader who appreciates them is one of the elect, unquote. Though the authors of the Mahāyāna Sutra were by no means objectivists avant la lettre, it would seem that both groups were able to employ similar techniques in developing and sustaining their clientele. The Mahāyāna Sutras we have explored likewise suggest that the reader who appreciates them is by that very fact one of the elect bodhisattvas of the traditions, who, though otherwise not in any concrete way distinguished, have received prophecy in the ancient and honorable order of Mahāyāna Buddhists, and who can accordingly view and interpret themselves, their co-religionists, and their social world through the narrative lenses provided by and in the literature of the sutras. So by way of conclusion, as should be more than clear by now, I am not trained as a literary critic, and I command neither the necessary nomenclature nor the associated analytical tools to give a properly literary critical reading of the Mahāyāna literature. But what I am able to do and see suggests very strongly to me that this literature is ripe and ready for someone who does have such skills to draw out a wealth of insights into the mechanics of its literary devices, as well as the impact these may have had upon their audiences. There has been one book published with the title Buddhist Scriptures as Literature, but it is deeply unsatisfying, the author being neither up to the task in terms of Buddhist philology nor in proper literary criticism. When I first publicly presented a part of what has become tonight's argument, I was joined on the panel by Natalie Gummer, who has done such important work unpacking the richness of the Suvarnabhasa. She has since, in 2012, published an important article in which she attempts to reconstruct how a rhetoric of identification, in this case of the reciting Dharmabhanaka with the Buddha and his audience with the audience in the text, within the horizons of the work, functioned in ritual, how this functioned in ritual enactments of recitation of the work. Gummer seeks to push her analysis further through looking at the, so this kind of analysis more on the simple level of what I was doing here. Gummer seeks to push her analysis further through looking at the work through the lenses of indigenous Indian aesthetical theories. In particular, she employs the ideas of Abhinavagupta on rasa, or aesthetic response. Following Abhinava, she advances a plausible homology between the ideal response suggested by the Suvarnabhasa of itself and that expected of readers of sophisticated court poetry, or kavya, a, quote, transpersonal and transformative experience, unquote, in which subject-object distinctions are elided experientially. There is a wealth of richness in her analysis, and I recommend the article, which is in Journal of the American Academy of Religion, volume 80, number 1. I find much of her argument compelling, but I do want to suggest an alternative way of engaging indigenous theory. The weakness of using Abhinava's theories is that unlike the audience-centered hermeneutics advanced by Gummer and I, Gummer and me, Abhinava insists that rasa is to be found in the text itself, rather than the audience. There is, however, another school of thought, that of Bhattanayaka, which locates the aesthetic phenomenon in the audience and provides analytical vocabulary for understanding its mechanics. Crucial to Bhattanayaka's work is the analysis of bhavana, or actualization, in literary works. And it may be noted, if you haven't already noted it, that this is exactly the word used in Buddhist contexts for the actualization of enlightened reality in the world, what is typically called meditation, bhavana. In the hermeneutical context, bhavana is the word for the literary process by which the fictional world of the text is made real for the reader. An important component of this process is bhavakatva. Sheldon Pollock, the leading expert on Bhattanayaka, writes, quote, bhavakatva is consistently defined as the literary process whereby the emotional states represented in the literary work are made into something in which the reader or spectator can fully participate. A synonym, so part of the problem here is that when you have erotic poetry about Sita, it's not really okay to lust after Sita, right? Because she's Sita. So there has to be a way in which you can lust after Sita but make it be socially acceptable. So they're trying to look at that reader response question. A synonym for this process of bhavakatva is sadharanikarana, or commonalization, made to be sadharana, to be held in common with someone else. That is, through literary skill, the world or horizon of the text is made to seem as if it were that of the viewer. They are thereby seduced into a willing suspension of disbelief of a high order, that wherein the audience not only feels in common with, but to some degree actually identifies with the characters of the work. Mimamsa hermeneutics, on which Bhattanayaka bases his work, theorizes the mechanics of how narratives describing prior enactments of Vedic rituals, the so-called Arthavada, become translated in reader response into incitements to act the same as the characters in the narrative. That is, the Mimamsaka wants to know why a reader, reading of a prior act, would self-identify and desire, even resolve, to act in the same way and offer the same sacrifice. Bhattanayaka suggests a way forward, beyond being convinced to undertake Vedic sacrifice, as in a scripture, to a place where only literature can take one, to a visceral feeling that offering sacrifice is merely who one is. One problem with applying classical Indian aesthetical theory to scriptural texts, one that is frequently, almost automatically mentioned by connoisseurs, is that it is explicitly said not to be applicable to scriptural texts, which are concerned with ethical behavior, not pleasure. Yet, as I think should be clear, Mahāyāna sutras are clearly not just history or just scripture, the two non-literary discursive forms for which rasa analysis is inapplicable for indigenous theorists. Many of them are clearly sophisticated literary works that do provide their own pleasures and which could benefit from the insights of such interpretative schemas. We moderns need not be constrained by the category taboos of indigenous Indian critics. We can and should treat sutras as literature. In so doing, we can draw on insights and terms of art employed in both classical Indian and modern literary criticism, going in the process far beyond my halting attempts in this paper. In so doing, I expect that, in addition to identifying the subtle workings of the literary sutras, not all sutras may be said to be literary in this sense, we might also make some further advance on Harrison's clarion call for us to, quote, see past the texts to the lives of the people that produced them, to ask what impact those lives had on the texts, and vice versa. Thank you.
Willing to take some questions?
Sure, yeah. Yes?
Thank you, that was really interesting. I was wondering if perhaps you could weigh in on a debate that I found myself in a few times over the past number of years, and this is how does the fourth wall come into play when we start thinking about the gender of the audience of the text and the imagined gender roles within the text? So the Lotus Sutra is kind of an interesting way to think about this, because there's an interesting part where some women get very sad, thinking, oh, I haven't received a prediction. And Buddhists, what are you talking about? You were the audience when I gave a general prediction to the audience. Of course, you are predicted to be an advanced bodhisattva. So this is kind of, it kind of also calls out to the audience of the text, saying that even the women listening to the text are included and considered to be advanced bodhisattvas. And, often when this prediction is made to the audience, we see masculine and feminine nouns used, saying gentlemen,
Sure, yeah.
ladies.
Yeah, putra
Gula
gula duhitava. Yeah.
But then we often see assemblies that are portrayed as mostly male, and we also see very masculine imagery used to talk about bodhisattvas.
Sure. Armor, heroism, yes, virya. Yeah.
And as Paul has famously said, women can ride in the great vehicle, but they cannot drive it. So I found myself in this debate over whether or not women could be considered to be advanced bodhisattvas because they're included in these general predictions, or if the masculine imagery of bodhisattvas still precludes them, even though they are included in these general audience predictions.
Yeah, I can't speak to the Buddhist theological question, like, how would a scholar, within the tradition resolve that question? But I did kind of begin to gesture in that direction with this small paragraph about the privacy of that. Often I presume it's not even a kind of verbal or conscious level connection, right? That connection that I am that person in the text is made kind of subliminally or subtly. So in theory, then, it's entirely plausible that children, women, otherwise socially denigrated groups or subordinated groups, hearing that text would have the same reader response. What consequences that might have in the real life, the social worlds in which they exist, I don't know. We can only speculate, I guess. I think the reason I mentioned it is to suggest that it's entirely plausible that even people who wouldn't, be able to really then make the cognitive step and say, yes, I am that person, and I'm Bhadrapala's buddy, and we're going to go on and be part of this community and really pledge ourselves to it. But there could be a subtle way in which those passages and the scriptures are kind of reaching out to a broader audience to bring them into the narrative as well. Which would be important, right? If particularly, I didn't elaborate on this here, but one of the background axioms is that this is a nascent, fragile community, and it's crucial for them to get buy-in from people. And the strong way to get buy-in is to read people into their meta story of the tradition. That hypothesis about kind of quiet identification by children and women may resonate with the rhetorical fact, the literary fact that you do have this, putra kula duhitava, like gender equality in the traditions. It's not a question I've gone into greatly, and my ability in gender theory is worse than my literary theory skills. So I think I'll leave it at that, unless there's a follow-up that I could work on. But
So I thank you. I enjoyed that immensely. Although it raises a lot of issues that we'll probably talk about over a beer or otherwise soon. But a couple of things occur to me. You selected 3 texts. and then you suggested that there was some sort of intertextuality between them, and I wondered about the basis for doing that, given that the kinds of rhetorical strategies you talk about are so widespread in so many Mahāyāna sutras that you could say that they're endemic, and then that makes it seem to me as though it's drawing a long bow to connect these three particular texts.
Right. I mean, part of that is reflecting the fact that it's not my field, and so I'm working with limited experience. But it is my impression, and please correct me, that the pattern of linked Vyakarana and Jataka is everywhere. And that is part of this sleight of hand where they want to say, you think the Mahāyāna is new, but actually it's way older than this, and you're actually the Johnny-come-lately who's just kind of random here provincially, and I can show this, and then you, and in fact, your culture heroes, right, Shariputra, Ananda, and so on, are on our team. So that much, I think, is, undeniably everywhere, and also, various gestures of breaking the fourth wall are also found fairly widely. As I said, the Ashta Sahasrika also has some passages of that sort. The Vajrachetika suggests it briefly. But I didn't see, and more work is probably necessary, those two things being together commonly. That on the one hand, you do have the rhetorical strategies of trying to provincialize the Shravakayana and elevate the Mahāyāna. And you also have these strategies of saying, you reader out there are part of us too. But the specific conjunction of those two or three things together, I see as being distinctive of those three. Is that wrong, or? And then the Bhadrapala, and I didn't really know what to make, as I told you privately. I mean, the Bhadrapala topos, that there's these 500, group of 500, the vanguard. At one point I had a kind of epigram, distorting Tennyson, the 500 riding into the breach, and wondering, to what extent was that also part of this? That somehow that particular story of Bhadrapala that's so central to the Pratyutpana might have had legs and been more widespread. We discussed last night doing word searches of various things, and I plowed around a little bit looking for 500 and didn't find and Bhadrapala, and it didn't pan out for me. So which I was disappointed by, because it's a great story, and I would like to see seen them having had a kind of prominent place in the imagination of the Mahāyāna traditions. But it seems that it's limited to a few places. And Lotus is one, and Pratyutpana is the other.
So another question I had was, at what point does captatio benevolentiae become breaking the fourth wall?
My Latin is weaker than yours.
In other words, the
been since 8th grade.
One does at the beginning of an address is flatter the audience.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right, that's what captatio means.
Right.
And so, that is a common rhetorical strategy, in many traditions, and I think we can see it in Mahāyāna sutras as well. But this, what you'll be describing, I think very persuasively, pushes that to a new level. And I wondered, there are a lot of things that would just fall into simple captatio. It's basically flattering your readers or flattering your hearers in
Right.
these cases. But then what is it then that pushes it over the edge into a fourth wall breaking strategy?
Yeah, I mean, that instance in the Lotus where the reader is specifically identified with named people is a smoking gun for me. I agree that there are passages that refer to the audience that don't necessarily do that they are just a way of saying, feel good about yourself, you're part of a good, thing going on. But But I do think that even there's something of the same phenomena going on, right? I mean, flattering the reader is a way of getting them to nod along, right? And part of what I think socially scriptures, must have been doing as well is trying to get people to nod along and say, this makes sense to me. This is a cogent, way of representing the values that we share. And it really is dependent upon a community, right? I mean, if you leave that, somebody who's, say, socialized into a Mahāyāna milieu leaves and goes somewhere else, where there's a Vaishnava milieu, unless they begin to alter their framing narratives, they will experience profound anomie and be isolated from the community and not, in fact, not be considered sane in a certain sense. I mean, this is what Berger suggests. And so it doesn't necessarily travel. I mean, that kind of phenomena requires a critical mass of people to be participating in this imaginaire together.
Can I just add to that though? But isn't part of your argument that non-Mahāyāna scriptures, mainstream Buddhist scriptures, don't flatter their readers? I mean, that's
yeah, I think that I would say that. I mean, I know of no extra textual referentiality in the mainstream scriptures I'm aware of. And and the way they talk about the Buddha is, of course, also very different. I mean, it's Gautama, it's not Bhagavan necessarily so much, and so on. But anyway, go ahead.
And then the second part of that is that aren't all of the rhetorical strategies you're talking about in service to the cult of the book? They aren't flattering readers in order to encourage the reader to make donations to the Sangha, for example. It's all about the book.
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, certainly what one sees in Buddhism across the board are precisely strategies for trying to overcome the profound fact that the Buddha's dead and gone, right? Stupas, relics, all ways of, again, with the tacit assumption that when Buddhas are around, when you meet a Buddha, stuff happens, right? And when Buddhas are gone, it's excruciatingly long and difficult to have that kind of thing, or very rare, unless you have roots of virtue from a past time that happen to be. But again, there's the implication that you probably don't, or you would have been born at the time of the Buddha, right? So the Buddhist community has tried to say, well, let's substitute some things, right? We can have relics, right, or we can have stupas. Scharf makes a really great point in his article on ritual in Critical Terms for Buddhist Studies, that a particular Zen ritual he analyzes is precisely meant to bring the kind of semiotically the body of the Zen master to represent a kind of consecrated image presencing the Buddha. Pratishta rituals, right, of bringing Buddhas into images of various sorts is all ways of kind of making that happen. And I see the book thing as just being another version of that, right? So it says it's a Chaitya Bhuta, right? A Chaitya just means not even necessarily a Buddhist, but a sacred locus, and something that's worthy of puja. And that can also be done by recitation, and probably more conventionally was, I think, and Gummer's analysis and a stress on the fact that the oral performance of these, I think, is apposite there. And again, her suggestions are very pregnant, I think, that not just are you reciting the scripture, the words of the Buddha, and thus people, that serving as a substitution, right? That we're not able, the Buddha's dead, we're not able to be in his presence, but these words are being articulated, and so we have a virtual experience of that. But she argues that kind of performatively, that reciter takes on a role virtually as if the Buddha, and the audience can then kind of imagine themselves into that community along the way, building solidarity and community. So yeah, I don't know if I'm fully answering your question, but I guess I don't see the book as such a big deal. It's one of many things. if I'm construing you correctly, that what you mean by the book is a physical artifact, like a text rather than a work. If the cult, because which is I think how people generally are talking, how Chopin was originally articulating that it's a text, not a work that you're talking about in the cult of the book. And Mahāyāna sutras are both, right? I mean, they're works in the sense that they're never fully realized in any particular physical artifact, but they are also, and in fact, maybe preeminently over against mainstream scriptures, textually located, portable, worshipable, spinnable. But, yeah.
I have a question sort of along the lines of John's first question about comparing to mainstream texts, and I'm wondering, because I'm compelled by your argument about narrative incorporation, and I'm wondering how you would say the literary devices you've studied compare to contemporaneous narrative traditions like maybe Jain. Because I think, on one, you're making an argument sort of across time, like looking at these traditions and then looking at Tibet or contemporary examples. But I wonder if to do the kind of literary analysis that you're calling for, if bringing in some sort of, sort of closer related in time and space might help point up what is really distinct about the Mahāyāna sutras that you're looking for. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's my answer is yes.
So you do see something very distinct in the Mahāyāna. Like
No, I say somebody should look into it. That's what I agree with. I have not done that work yet. Again, I'm totally poaching here on other people's territory. This is, not my usual grounds. And so, this is something that occurred to me when I was looking through some various things with students and kind of like some of the work I've done on Vajrayana, something that seems so obvious, but I look around and it doesn't seem like anybody actually said it. And so, I don't think any of this is probably new to people that know this material, but it hasn't been articulated as such. So, yeah, I mean, like all research, it's a kind of a question mark for further questions, probing and testing.
But if I can just piggyback on Alex's question, which may be simply restating it in different terms, the question arises if this is so pervasive and distinctive.
Why wasn't anybody else doing
Get
it?
the idea to do it.
Right.
I mean, did it emerge from the Buddhist tradition alone, or was that was the beginning of it, right?
No.
Or did they borrow it from somebody? Is something happening more broadly in Indian culture that would push things in this direction?
Well, where would we look? Puranas? Not in my reading. There's, stuff there. And they tend to be fairly prosaic and often ritually oriented. More like tantric kind of type things. Stefan Bayer did an interesting thing comparing Mahāyāna sutras to the Gita and visionary literature, a very small kind of one-off. But nothing like this. Looking more at kind of, vision quests, is how we put it. So I don't know of anything comparable in that way. But it's a really good question, and one I'm embarrassed not to have thought about previously. But they're weird, aren't they, the Mahāyāna sutras? They're big, and they're kind of Trumpian, right? They're just like all about like, woo, like, some of them are totally boring, right? And it's just like, okay, here's some stuff, da 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 da. Shali Stamba's pretty dry and stuff, but there are these particular ones that have caught my interest in some ways because they're doing some really strange things with narrative and with the audience. I was in the lunch today with the graduate students. I was, excoriating the tendency in our fields to cordon ourselves off into little Hindu studies and Buddhist studies and Jain studies universes and not to read across, and that the really best work that's being done nowadays by the younger generation are people that are reading across that, and that's really where the new kind of paradigms are going to come from, if anywhere, I think. And I can say that partly and hold my head up because I've been forced to do that by the very nature of tantric materials. But I personally have not done that very widely in other narrative materials. And And truth be told, as I said, I mean, I don't have a particularly sensitive ear for narrative. I have a few reference points, but yeah, I mean, I really hope mainly this is not something I'm going to be able to do. I mean, it's people that really know literary theory. I mean, I'm kind of inspired to do it. I mean, and in leading up to this, I was pouring through all this audience response material and thinking, God, I got to do that. I got to do that. And actually have a vocabulary where I can begin to pinpoint more precisely what I'm more generally intuitively gesturing at. And I do think I was particularly intrigued by this notion of sadharanikarana, that you can make the audience read the Indian theorists already were talking about how audiences begin to respond in ways as if they're in the text. And we see it in films, right? That people feel like, they go see Star Wars and then they dress up and wave around a toy lightsaber afterwards, right? There's something compelling about that. And the mechanisms are probably different, right? I mean, film has a particular way of manipulating identity and narrative that's different from written text or recited text. So that would need to be distinguished. But they all have whatever we call literary, and again, that's a problematical category, but the way I was using it at the end, saying that some texts are literary and some are not, is defining literary in that way, that they're texts that are able to kind of bring the audience in and lose their sense of separation and get seduced into or drinking the Kool-Aid, as they say, thinking I'm now in the text, right? And the values of the text or the values of the world that's in that imaginative work are mine, at least temporarily.
I think what is very interesting in this respect is the Indian penchant for nested narratives of the sort that your colleague Wendy Donegan has studied so brilliantly. And the notion of the story within the story within the story, which seems to be very strong in the Indian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I think more than anywhere else, where people wake up and they find that the story they thought that they were living in is not the real story. There's another one. And there's another. So I think Mahāyāna Sutras play with this to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
And in your discussion of Vyakarana and Jataka, we see that too.
Yeah, the Mahabharata is a text where one might look for some of these things, and as they say, if it's not there, it's not anywhere, right? And another monument of Indian literature that I only know very superficially, but I can't but imagine. I mean, what brushes I have had with it, that for people relating to it in different ways, there must be kind of uncomfortable moments of not dissociation, but disjunction, right? When you are kind of in a story and then suddenly, boop, you're back in another frame and you're trying to think yourself well, what level am I at, right? I mean, I have this experience with Tibetan scholastic literature, right? It's all nested within these outlines, right? And you get into a certain topic and then suddenly, boom, you're up in another level of the hierarchy and you don't know who you are or where you are.
I think the film Inception plays with that.
Inception? So, haven't seen that, but yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. First, comment on the influence of this, breaking of the fourth wall. That's actually really common now in postmodern literature, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And film, yeah.
Yeah, visual imagery that emerged, because visual imagery was the most accessible method, I think, for most people accessing Buddhism.
Mm-hmm. Its relationship to visual culture. Whew. It's a great question, and I only have maybe more questions as usual, more in response. I mean, we do see, at least in Tibetan works based upon Indian works, and I don't know the Indic models as well as I should here either, of painting or carving the donor or the interactor into the actual work of art itself, right? So that the work of art becomes itself a kind of audience response representation of how one should relate to the work of art ideally. Which of course the Mahāyāna Sutras do as well, right? So there are stories about what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to relate to them. the question that I really have there, though, is how, I mean, the thing about the postmodern breaking of the fourth wall is that it's characteristic of a highly mobile modern society in which narratives and narrative breakdown is the order of the day. I mean, it's common. People are constantly reinventing themselves and reshaping their narratives. I mean, this is part of what adolescence is, right? That people say, oh, that's childish stuff that I'm behind. I'm some new person. But how advanced was irony in the audiences who would have been relating to this material? Clearly, they weren't idiots, right? They knew that this was, something that's created, right? I mean, there are people in the text, right, who say, oh, this is just kavikrita kavya, right? This is poetic, some poem produced by a poet, right? And so even if they didn't think that before, a lot of Mahāyāna sutras actually suggested to the reader that they might consider that, presumably as a homeopathic prophylactic defense against that, right? The way you have in soap commercials, right? They say, oh, well, we're not one of those fake soaps that make great claims, but don't deliver, right? And so they explicitly raise the idea that they're a fake in order to counteract the idea that they're a fake. Yeah, I mean, what did Paul say in this, that we barely understand the genre? I mean, there are so many profound questions that we don't know about how learned, semi-learned audiences in India processed the materials that we have. And in the Mahāyāna case, I think they're, really profound questions, just about what, again, the question of what is a Mahāyāna sutra, right? And to what extent are the categories that we bring, because we have them in a library, and the Chinese organized them this way, and the Tibetan organized them that way, and Vaidya has them in this little, 4-foot shelf. What was really going on in terms of what little mini corpora they considered? Would anyone at the time have ever dreamed that the Suvarna and the Pratyutpana and the lotus had anything to do with each other? It's hard to pin down. I mean, there's some indications in Scalia and so on, but my sense is that in traditional societies, the sense of irony is less profound because and there's some empirical evidence for this in sociology, right? That Berger also suggests examples where, anthropologists went into traditional societies in Saudi Arabia and asked them, like, well, what do you think your life would be like if you weren't a Muslim, right? And they just total blank. Like the narratives were so deeply entrenched that even in their imagination, they couldn't move out and begin to discourse about what that might be like. And we moderns live in a completely different, fragmented, hyper-ironic world. And so reading, or imagining how readings would work in a society very different from ours is a profound challenge.
I'm a little concerned that our speakers on a different time zone must be getting really hungry.
It is 7:30, so we're right on schedule here.
We can break now, continue the discussion over food in the department. No, not before thanking you.
Oh, well, thanks.